Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Caitlin Saladino, and I'm the Senior Director of Research and Development here at Brookings Mountain West. On behalf of my colleagues Bill Brown, Ashley LeClaire, our Executive Director Dave Demore, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight for what is the first of our Spring 2025 Brookings Scholar Lecture Series talks here at UNLV. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our donors to Brookings Mountain West. Of course, without their support, we would not be able to host the events that we host, including the one here tonight, so we're grateful for their support. And of course, thank you to our wonderful colleagues in the Greenspan College of Urban Affairs with UNLV TV who are helping us to record this. There are many, many, many slides tonight, so don't frantically write them down. We will have them and the recording of this video available on our website just a few short days, as always. So as we kick off the Brookings Scholar Lecture Series this spring, we're delighted to welcome our colleague, Rashawn Ray, here to Brookings Mountain West for the very first time. Like all our visitors, he's been busy this week lecturing in UNLV courses, meeting with stakeholders, teaching, and of course, meeting with faculty on campus. I also want to take a moment to give a special thanks to a couple UNLV colleagues, Clay T. White and Michael Green, for their generosity of time and knowledge. Yesterday afternoon, Clay T., Michael, and our team at Brookings Mountain West were led on an incredible tour of historic West Las Vegas, and I think Rashawn will agree it's going to stick with us for a long time beyond this week, so thank you for your time. Before we jump into our lecture tonight, let me share a little bit about Rashawn's background so you're all apprised. Rashawn comes to us from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where he's a senior fellow in governance studies. He's renowned for his expertise in understanding and addressing racial and social inequality and explores topics such as policing, criminal justice reform, health policy, wealth disparities, and family policy. In addition to his role at Brookings, Rashawn is a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. And as the founding executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, Rashawn has helped develop a virtual reality training program for law enforcement and led implicit bias trainings with thousands of police officers, military personnel, and employees at companies and organizations across the U.S. And of course, if you want to stay up to date on Rashawn's work, you can always connect with him on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at Sociologist Ray. I can personally attest he's an excellent follow. I recommend you do that now. And after the talk tonight, we'll probably have a bit of time for audience Q&A, so if you can reserve that for then, give me an opportunity to get around to you with the microphone for our recording, and we'll take those questions towards the end of the evening. So without further ado, I'd like to ask for your help welcoming Rashawn Ray up to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Caitlin, thank you so much for that warm introduction. It is so great to see you all this evening. Look, I've had a great time here, and so I appreciate the tour. I appreciate all the meetings, the classes. It's been great. Hopefully, I can share some interesting points about how we actually create community-driven policy solutions as it relates to police accountability. So I'll jump straight in and get going. I think for many of us, it was a breaking point with George Floyd and what happened 5 years ago now in Minneapolis. And I think partly that happened because the world has stopped. Because of COVID, everyone was forced to pay attention to something that people have experienced in certain communities for far too long, that oftentimes does not get recorded, oftentimes does not get picked up. And I think that this image fully represents that. As we've seen over time, we've seen images such as these when we think about social movements and the sort of things that's happened. When you look at these two images, I don't know about you, but I really can't tell them apart. However, they are actually 50 years apart. And it speaks to, on one hand, how far we've came, like being in this room. On the other hand, how far we haven't came, particularly when it comes to policing interactions. And then no matter what people's level of education, their income, their ability to live in certain neighborhoods, if they can't walk peacefully down the street, or if they can't engage in the same sorts of behaviors as others, then what life do they actually have? And I think part of reflecting over the past decade is looking at the shift in attitudes by race about policing. one of the things that people always highlight is they'll say, oh, well, blacks are much more likely to say that fatal encounters with police are problematic. But if you actually look at this graphic and you look at whites, over half of whites were saying in 2015 that interactions between black people and the police were signs of something bigger. That's something bigger, I would simply just say that it's systemic racism, and we'll unpack this and kind of get to it and break down the tenets of that. But the point is that when we go back to 2015, 2016, 2014 with Michael Brown, 2015 with Freddie Gray, we start to see these patterns playing out. And part of what it allows us to do is get to a policy window. When we look at all of these different social movements over time, from ending slavery to dealing with the civil rights movement, to marriage equality, to climate, to, of course, guns and policing and women's rights, we see that there's been a policy window. Always think about a policy window like a match. A match has been lit, and you have a certain amount of time to address it before it goes out. But while you're doing the work, particularly for people on the front lines, it's kind of like, you know, a Yankee candle, like those really nice big Yankee candles that people have that smell all good in your house. And then, you know, the wax gets down really, really low. And so you're trying to like go down into the candle and finish the last little part. What's going to happen with that match is that it's going to come up and probably burn a part of your skin. That's what happens with social movements, the people who are on the front lines doing that work. And when that match goes out, it is a situation where it becomes difficult to address. And I think that we are there with policing. Even though, unfortunately, based on some of the stats that I'll show you, there is a high probability that we'll have another incident pop up pretty soon. Now, over the past 15 years or so, and you heard from Caitlin, I've done work in a lot of different areas. But as it relates to policing, over the past 15 years, I've collected a lot of data on policing. And I'm going to share some of those data with you tonight and what some of the policy insights are. From a large data set on Twitter, looking at how social movements operate through the lens of social media and is actually reflective of what's happening on the ground. A large ethnographic study conducting implicit bias trainings with 1,200 police officers. I've conducted implicit bias trainings with thousands of police officers around the country at this point. Interviews with civilians and police officers about body-worn cameras, police-civilian relationships, and Black Lives Matter. And then a virtual reality training program that you heard Caitlin mention that I developed with some colleagues, computer scientists, engineers, and then later with Google, in addition to a state-level database on police reform policies that I'll be sharing specifically about how it relates to Nevada and also the city of Las Vegas. I'm gonna aim to cover these things here. I'm gonna aim to talk about the evolution of Black Lives Matter, which will be pretty quick. I think most people would know that. Talk about what do police think about Black Lives Matter, the social psychology of criminalization, how at the end of the day, we're talking about interactions between individuals on a micro level, and then of course, the virtual reality work and then the policy prescriptions. Theoretically, the way that I think about my work, on a macro level, we think about policies. And I think for too long, when we've looked at policing, we primarily focused on the green, the micro level, these interactions between people, not realizing that these interactions are structured. Not only are they structured by race and class segregations of neighborhoods, but they are also structured by policing policy, and then also supported by the organizational processes of police departments. Policing as an institution is a paramilitary organization, and there are policies that operate through it, rules, procedures, processes that actually impact what happens on the ground, regardless of who the police officer might be. And I'll share some of that with you all. So quickly, talking about the evolution of Black Lives Matter, for a lot of people, that starts with Michael Brown, who was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. However, it actually started with the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012. And on a personal note, this killing was actually the catalyst that, in many ways, led me here tonight. And thinking about that in 2012, I had a 16-month-old who was running around, trying to do whatever 16-month-olds do, and I'm holding my newborn in my hands, rocking him in a chair while I was doing my postdoc at the University of California at Berkeley. And on the news comes on a segment about what happened to Trayvon Martin. And I look at this one baby running around, and I look at the one that I'm holding, and I thought, you're not doing enough to protect them, little Black boys that look like them, and all kids from experiencing what Trayvon Martin did. And I was already doing work in this area. I was actually doing work on physical activity. I was just interested in why people engage in physical activity or not. And then race just started popping up everywhere. It was like the way that racial segregation impacted and in many ways inhibited certain people from engaging in physical activity, particularly middle-class Black people, and particularly middle-class Black men, who were oftentimes stereotyped and criminalized when they were in public space, just simply trying to go for a run, simply trying to walk around their neighborhood. They became strangers in their own neighborhood, where the police will be called on them, dogs will be sicked on them. And so while I was doing that work, and simultaneously what was happening with Trayvon Martin, I said there is a gap here that could actually be filled. And one big thing that you all probably don't know about what happened to Trayvon Martin, raise your hand if you knew that the Martin family was awarded more than a $1 million settlement from the HOA. One person. That's not surprising. The money is a large part of the story that I'm going to share with you all tonight. I think regardless of what we might think about what happened to Trayvon Martin, I think most of us will probably have a problem with our HOA being used after George Zimmerman killed him, after he went to the store to get a bottle of iced tea and some Skittles during halftime of the NBA All-Star game. Now, what we know that after Trayvon Martin was killed and after George Zimmerman was found not guilty, that 3 Black women came together. They were engaging on social media. This is part of the social media story. And they were like, Black lives don't matter, our lives don't matter. And then they finally got to Black Lives Matter. And this is one of the ways, one of the places where it comes from. What I did with some of my colleagues was we started collecting Twitter data, primarily with humanists. I'm very interdisciplinary in the work that I do. So I started working with English scholars, with historians, to collate a whole bunch of data. They were just collecting Twitter data. They didn't even exactly know what to do with it. I was like, I know what to do with it. So we collected all these data, which you can see here, all these tweets. We primarily focused on 4 key periods of time. When Michael Brown was killed, the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, that's the officer who killed him, the Department of Justice report, and 1 year after Michael Brown's death. A few things that we could do with these data. First, we could really highlight the images that were most popular on Twitter. These were some of them, and just kind of go back into your lexicon and think about what you were seeing at that time. Some of them you could see, particularly when we start talking about the ones on the top right that really look like it's a war zone. But the ones on the top, the one on the top left, where people across racial divides were coming together. The one on the bottom right, where the monks from Myanmar flew all the way from their country to come and support. These were some of the images that we were less likely to see. What were some of the themes that popped up? When we were looking at Black Lives Matter as a hashtag, when people would use it, we conducted a qualitative thematic coding to figure that out. One big theme was Black people killed with impunity and whites not. So there would be images such as these posted on Twitter showing Black people who were killed by police who did not kill anyone, and white people who were apprehended by police but not killed. They were arrested. And these were the sort of images that were popping up there. But for people who study social movements, know that for every narrative, there is a counter-narrative. The counter-narrative to Black Lives Matter is not all lives matter. In fact, that is a statement, a slogan, really, in many ways, that has been inflamed by mainstream media as a way to kind of frame what was happening. Instead, the counter to Black Lives Matter is called TCOT. Raise your hand if you ever heard of TCOT. Couple people. Okay, so TCOT stands for Top Conservatives. Yeah, TCOT stands for Top Conservatives on Twitter. I've been in classes and all kind of stuff, right? So I've been talking about some of this. Top Conservatives on Twitter. And you might not know TCOT, but you know what they do and you know what they did. TCOT takes credit for revitalizing the alt-right, takes credit for firmly cementing the Tea Party into the Republican Party, where you have moderate Republicans who have become troublesome bedfellows with the far right and Tea Party Republicans, the same way that moderate Democrats have become bedfellows with progressives in ways that our overly simplistic two-party system has led to. TCOT takes credit for a lot of things, and this is how popular it was. This is a graphic showing of all the hashtags used, of the 32 million, which ones were most popular. The ones that are most central and largest are the ones that were most popular. TCOT's right there by Black Lives Matter. Only a couple of people in this room have heard about it. Why is that? Because in social media, there are echo chambers. Echo chambers where we don't interact with people who have different views than us. And when we do, it creates a level of political polarization that's destructive in so many different ways. Of the 32 million tweets, less than 1/10 of 1% use the hashtags Black Lives Matter and TCOT together. They are simply having different conversations. And this is a graphic showing how popular TCOT was based on its hashtag ranking. When the Department of Justice report came out showing egregious forms of racial discrimination in Ferguson, TCOT was more popular than the hashtags Black Lives Matter and Michael Brown and Mike Brown. And yet, only a couple of people have ever heard about it. Because as much as we think that social media is a reflection of society, it's oftentimes only a reflection of us. And that's a limited viewpoint. And these are the type of tweets that will come up. This one is probably a bit satirical, but it got picked up by the right and really got inflamed. According to Darren Wilson, this is what happened, no reason not to believe him. It's showing a monster that's supposed to be Michael Brown, where he is crushing a police car and is saying, "You will die mortal." And then all the way on the bottom with the American flag, that's former Officer Darren Wilson, who killed Michael Brown. And what this is getting at is during the grand jury testimony, Officer Darren Wilson said that he felt like he was 4 years old and Michael Brown looked like he was Hulk Hogan. And he said that he looked like a demon. I don't know about you, but like in my house, we like Halloween. We dress up and do all that. We like scary movies. You got to do a whole lot to take out a demon. Like you can't just do normal stuff. So if you start to treat a human being like they're a demon, it justifies the excessive force. And this is a script that police officers learn. They say, "I fear for my life," or someone else fear for their life. And it justifies the use of force that was used. What's interesting about Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, now you've seen Michael Brown, you've probably seen his size. He had just turned 18, like literally just turned 18, which in America legally all of a sudden transformed him from a teenager to a man that quickly, right? Even though we know that Black boys in particular oftentimes are perceived to be older than what they are. Michael Brown was 6'4". He's a big dude. Darren Wilson was also 6'4". Both of them were big. So these are the sort of facts that people oftentimes don't know. What do police officers think about? What do police officers think about Black Lives Matter? I just want to point out two bar lines. Look at the gold one on the left and the green one in the middle. Those are more experienced police officers who hold very negative views of Black Lives Matter. What we found, it wasn't about race. This was not about white officers necessarily overwhelmingly viewing Black Lives Matter and even Black people in a negative way. It was more experienced officers who are now invested in the institution and the social organization of policing. And they feel the need to protect it at all costs. To what extent do they do that? Well, these were some of the more positive, neutral comments, particularly from younger officers across race. I mean, they march, they have rallies, which is great. You know, they bring about awareness. White officer, 3 years of experience, said they're out there for a cause, they're out there for a reason, but at times, I suppose, just like anything else type of protest, you have individuals where it can go a bit differently. It was a different perspective. But just look at this top quote. Officer with 10 years of experience. I think Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is a domestic terrorist organization just like the KKK. I bet you know, and they're hell-bent on seeing the U.S. burn. That is the extent to which more experienced officers thought about Black Lives Matter. Now, we know that people simply didn't start protesting in the street because they just felt the need to do it. They didn't even simply start doing it because of George Floyd or Michael Brown. The list could go on, Tamir Rice. But instead, it was oftentimes based on everyday experiences that people were having. This is data from 2015. I'm going to show you all a series of slides just showing disparities. You could just look at the gaps. This is showing across different types of interactions with police, from arrest to street stop, use of force, lethal force, that Black people are significantly more likely to experience those outcomes. Not only that, though, when we look at Hispanics are more likely to have force used upon them. White people, on the other hand, but beyond the street stop, are significantly less likely to have things happen to them. See, what's important is for the longest time, we viewed policing through a deficit lens. We viewed it as things that happen to Black people because they're Black. What we don't talk enough about are things that don't happen to white people or do happen to white people in the terms of preferential treatment in terms of their experiences that we don't talk enough about. And this leads to these gaps where it's not just what happens to black people in a deleterious way, but it's also the fact of what doesn't happen to white people or the benefit of the doubt that they're given that creates an even bigger gap. And this graph shows this. We're gonna go through a bunch of different cities. You're gonna see all the same trends. Black drivers make up 65% of the stops in South LA. When we look in Oakland, black people followed by Latinos are more likely to be stopped and searched relative to other groups. We could go to Minnesota. We see that blacks followed by Latinos are more likely to be pulled over compared to others. And then we see the negatives. So based on their percentage of the population, they are even less likely to have these experiences. So we see these gaps in policing. We can go to Ohio, Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland, pick a city. We still see these same disparities. And we can go to New Jersey, where we see the likelihood of black people experiencing more force, and then the departments where white people, relative to their percentage of that area, are significantly less likely to experience force. And what type of force are we talking about? Well, for white people, they're just slightly more likely to experience a compliance hold. You all know what a compliance hold is? That's like what you do with somebody who you probably care about that's having like an episode. You just hold them. That's a compliance hold. Chokehold, on the other hand, you're trying to choke somebody out, right? So you got hands, fists, being kicked, pepper sprayed, having a dog sicked on you, being hit with a baton, then of course, deadly force with a gun. We see these disparities across the board. We can go to my great state of Tennessee, where I was born at, right by Nashville and Murfreesboro, where I went to college at in Memphis. You can see arrest and then the population, the huge disparities in terms of what that looks like across the board. Now, what are people getting arrested for? Aggravated assault, larceny and theft, and possession of marijuana, which is a big one. Why is that? Because research documents that there are no racial differences in the usage of this particular type of drug, and also for other types of drugs in many ways. Of course, we can get into the disparities between crack and powder cocaine and who has access to opioids and that sort of thing. But the point is, people are doing drugs, but it's a big discrepancy in who is actually getting pulled over and arrested and prosecuted for those drugs. Interestingly, for Memphis, I have a quick story real quickly that I think is pretty interesting. When I was a freshman in college in Memphis, my friends and I in the dorm that I was staying in the freshman dorm, we wanted to, well, there were also upperclassmen there, but there was a lot of freshmen. We wanted to go to the mall down the street. I had a car, we get in the car. It was me and 3 or 4 of my friends, and one of my friends had these like blow pop suckers. I don't know if y'all remember them, like the real big ones, like they were thick, had big pieces of gum in the middle, right? And we had the green apple suckers. I really like the green apple suckers. So we get pulled over right when we leave campus. Cop pulls us over. I'm looking at the people in my car because I'm a freshman. So I'm like, I don't really know y'all that well yet. Like, so is there something that I need to know, right, before they get up to my car? They were like, no. So they come up, police walk up. They're talking, they ask for stuff, and I say, well, can you tell me why you pulled me over? All right, he was being a little smart. There was a cop in the back looking at the car, looking under the car. And he goes, well, we saw weed. And I was like, you saw weed? And so now, again, I'm looking in the back because I'm like, what's going on? And then we realized we had the blow pop suckers. They saw something green and just used it as a justification to pull us over. What's fascinating about that is, being 18, 19, we started laughing. That was a horrible decision. We started laughing, right? Because it was so absurd. And one of the cops got so upset. And then they got a call and they left. Now, I say that for a few reasons. The first reason I say that is because I realized a few years ago, almost more than a few years ago now, when I turned 40, that's one of them years you start reflecting on your life. Like, you had those moments where you're like, what have I done? What am I doing? What's going on? But one of the realizations I had is that I've been pulled over more times than my age by the police. I lived in 14 places before I turned 18 years old. I've lived in a lot of places for school, a lot of different states. I shouldn't have to say this. I don't have a criminal record and I have a PhD. That is one of the realities. That when you talk to a lot of black men, it is a reality that if it hasn't happened, unfortunately it will. And if it has, it becomes a battle scar that you've hopefully survived. The second thing I realized is how growing up, my family actually helped me get out of situations. My great uncle was the first black chief of police in my hometown. My uncle is a cop, my cousin is a cop. Didn't stop me from getting pulled over, but it did stop things from escalating because I was able to say who my family was in ways that other people could not. The third thing I realized as I reflect on that incident in Memphis, that Tyree Nichols, which was one of the most recent incidents, who was killed by police, mostly by black police officers in Memphis. He was simply trying to go to his mama's house. He didn't make it. That as we reflect on these incidents, they become interesting in how different people I know in different ways play out in these statistics. And ultimately, when we talk about Tyree Nichols, end up in these particular stats about police killings by year. That despite all the movement and all the work that's been done over the past decade, police killings continue to rise. And as much people talk about policy change, particularly at the city level, I'll show you all that, it hasn't changed the main outcome that I think shifts everything else, and that's police killings. And what I'm gonna share with you all with the solutions is that I think we've been getting the solutions wrong. We've been piecemealing things instead of focusing on other things. This is a graph showing major cities, police departments, and the likelihood of people being killed by the police per million. You see where Vegas is there on the left at roughly about 4, depending on some more recent years, it might be close to 5. But when you look at it, pretty much in the middle there, when we look at populations that are of the size of Vegas. But similar to all the other cities that I showed, in Vegas, blacks and Latinos are more likely to be pulled over for traffic stops than whites. They're more likely to be handcuffed and arrested. Black men in Clark County are 4 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession. So these same patterns are playing out. And then when it comes to police killings, a black person is about 2 times more likely, and Latinos are nearly 1 times more likely than whites to be killed by the police. When we look in North Las Vegas, it's nearly 3 times as likely if you're black. So these patterns that we're talking about here in Vegas, Vegas is not an anomaly. There are things that are actually happening very well here in Vegas that I'll mention in a second. But when it comes to the main outcomes that I want to focus on, we see that disparity. I want to walk you all through this important graph. It's data from the FBI. I actually helped the FBI to try to get police departments to submit their use of force data. Maybe surprisingly, maybe not. It is not required for police departments to submit use of force data to the federal government. It is incentivized, actually. Their tax money is used to incentivize them to send use of force data. But when we look at the departments that did submit, so if we take this as a conservative estimate, we might assume then these are the departments that thought they looked pretty good. They submitted it. It was close to 40%. Oh, and I should also mention this too. The federal government said that the data could not be released until it reached a particular threshold well over 40%. So these data aren't super public because of that. And now, there's probably not gonna be any data in where we are now. The top bar shows the percentage of the population. The second bar are the people killed by police. So now let's walk through why we see these disparities. Because there are a whole bunch of reasons that people throw out. So let me debunk a few. This graph, I think, debunks a lot. Second graph, people killed by the police. Only one bar goes up. That is black people, where you see that spike. For whites and for Latinos, it goes down. Now, at this point, some people say, oh, well, maybe black people were engaged in behavior that led to them being more likely to be killed by the police. No, because the third bar is people who were not attacking and who were also unarmed at the time they were killed. Only one bar goes up, and that's for black people. Let me just make this very clear. Second bar is showing black people are more likely to be killed by the police. About 2.5 times of their percentage of the population. The third bar shows when black people are not attacking and when they don't have a weapon. We would assume that the racial gap would shrink, right? Like police, mind you, these are police reports. Police are saying, did they have a weapon? Nope. Did they attack you? Nope. You killed them anyway. The racial gap gets larger. What explains that? Race explains that. That's the unfortunate reality. This is another graph by Nancy Krieger and her colleagues at Harvard, showing for young men, black and white men, what is happening with their experiences with the police. Now, I'm just gonna quickly tell you what you're looking at. The top two lines are black people. The bottom two lines are white people, the dotted lines. The straight lines are black people. You're probably looking at that spike, the red spike. This was a graph looking at race and social class. The red are college-educated people, college-educated black men and white men. The teal are lower income and lower socioeconomic status black and white men. It clearly shows it's not about social class. It's about race. But if anything, it's about race and social class in the opposite direction. What is that spike? Those were our civil rights leaders being killed in the 1960s, 1970s. That's that spike. There's also research showing, what about people's behavior? What about people's behavior? Part of what we see here in this particular graph, this was a study in New York City, nearly 700,000 police stops, showing that black people are more likely to be stopped by the police, followed by Latinos, followed by whites. But of these nearly 700,000 stops, only 2% led to the discovery of contraband, a weapon, or a previous criminal record. But 56% of these stops led to frisking. And then you see the numbers there and the number of times force was actually used on people. Now, another argument people make, they say, oh, well, police killings corresponds to crime, right? They say that it tracks. Where we see more violent crime, we see more police killings. No, we don't. This is showing violent crime from the 1960s up until 2024. We see that, although not at historic lows, definitely at lows in most of our lifetimes here in terms of what that looks like. And now let's just look at COVID, because this does track with Vegas as well. We saw a spike in murders and in most crimes during COVID. Most of these were crimes of opportunity, passion crimes, people who knew each other, people being locked in the house for too long with people who they love, but they hadn't really spent that much time with them. And you see these trends, and now you see it coming back down. These are other outcomes. I just showed you murder. We have motor vehicle thefts. We have violent crime. We have property crime. All of these trends have went down. People were trying to figure out what was going on. It was COVID. People were in the house. They couldn't work. If you're here in Vegas and you work on the Strip, like, you couldn't work. You couldn't put food on the table. You couldn't keep your lights on. And you're stuck at home watching TV or on social media. That is driving these incidents, because right after COVID, in May, we then had George Floyd. But the perception that people will have, they'll have you thinking, oh, it's because of Black Lives Matter protest. It's the response to Ferguson. That cops don't want to get involved. Yeah, right. I just showed y'all a graph that we have the most police killings ever. Believe me, police are not taking off. That's not happening. When we look at violent crime in major cities, we actually see, if you look on the left and the right, on the left you have property crimes, on the right you have violent crime. Vegas is lower than I think people would think, especially given the Strip. Now, given how many people come to Vegas, Las Vegas PD has more officers. A lot of that is justified given the amount of people that come in a small period, in a small space. And I think you all would agree with that. One of the other things that I want to mention that, of course, probably impacts everyone here, from being on campus, a few buildings over, to being on the Strip, and that's gun violence. That I want to make it clear, as much as I'm talking about policing, gun violence is a problem. But as I'll show you in one of the next graphs, they are issues that separately require intervention, not the same. Both of them are problems, but they require something different. This was an interesting analysis that I did with one of my colleagues, Rebecca Shankman at Brookings, where we really were interested in lockdown protest. And what was happening with COVID. And we discovered this interesting trend where people were just buying up a whole bunch of guns and a whole bunch of ammo. And it tracked in states that were more liberal, where you had people in more liberal places purchasing guns. Now, I want to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean it was liberal people purchasing the guns, but people were purchasing the guns. And you see where Nevada is there, where during this brief period during COVID, that in Nevada, still not as high as others, but pretty high on the list, an over 300% spike in gun permit applications. In 3 months, people were freaked out. They didn't know what to do. So some of the outcomes that we see spills over. This is a graphic showing the relationship between police killings and violent crime. See, if police killings tracked with violent crimes, you would see those X's in the same line as you see the squares, but you don't. They are not really statistically related hardly at all. Both matter, but they're different. Now, what's interesting, Vegas is actually one of the best here. That's right in the middle. Vegas is, there are maybe a couple that are a little bit better, but Vegas actually tracks, meaning the violent crime rate tracks with the police killing rate in a way that, not saying we want to see people get killed, but it does track in interesting ways. Now I want to talk about a couple things. I've talked about the criminalization of Black men in particularly predominantly white neighborhoods. I've done a lot of work with attorney Ben Crump and his staff to use my research to highlight different sort of issues. One was around what happened to Ahmaud Arbery down in Georgia, where he was killed while he was out for a jog by white men, a father and a son. And my research actually highlighted and helped to explain that, where if you look on the top right, what I found was that Black men were significantly less likely to engage in physical activity in predominantly white neighborhoods, which was interesting considering that these neighborhoods oftentimes had more resources. But it lacked one of the main resources, and that was safety and comfort for these men. Now, part of what I'm highlighting then is the way that bias plays out. See, bias isn't only about implicit bias or explicit bias, but it's about the way that bias is deeply ingrained in organizational cultures. It becomes justified in what's said. It becomes justified in what's written, and it becomes accepted. It becomes simply accepted that if police go to a particular neighborhood, that it's justified that they might use force there. So we wanted to address this in a couple of ways. The big way we wanted to address it was through implicit bias trainings. I could talk about the viability of that. It's one tool, but it's extremely limited in a lot of different ways. But I want to highlight a couple of stats. We gave officers the implicit association test out of Harvard. It was the way that we got at implicit bias. It has limits. We could talk about the methodological limits, but it was one tool we used with a very diverse group of police officers, very diverse group. We found that these officers overwhelmingly had made associations between Black people and weapons. And they didn't hardly make any associations between white people and weapons. So what this means is Blackness becomes weaponized. That even when Black people don't have a weapon, it's perceived that their physical bodies can cause harm. From Michael Brown to some of the other incidents that I mentioned, we see that playing out. So we wanted to come up with a solution. I helped lead the development of a virtual reality training program. Ultimately, it led to doing work with Google, where we developed a virtual reality training program with them. And one of the first things that we did was we developed 2 types of scenarios, developed over 90 virtual reality scenarios that get at a host of different outcomes. We were really interested in mental health because that's a key pattern that I haven't talked a lot about, that police encounter people with mental health issues and they don't really know how to interact with them. They confuse their symptoms for something else, and we wanted to try to address that. So we went out with police officers. We filmed pullover scenes. We filmed scenes in different types of neighborhoods. And at the time we were doing this several years ago, if you could kind of look on the top left picture, you see this little circular thing. That was actually the virtual reality camera that captured the space in a 360-degree space. Now you can kind of just use your phone, but we were like ahead of the time. So we ended up then developing this with Google. And this is the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland. This is Connor, Dr. Powelson now. He's doing a postdoc at Clemson. What you see showing on the screen, this is what the virtual reality looked like when they went in. And the algorithm would actually respond to officers in real time to give them a real look at what will be happening in these settings. And on the right, these will be objectives that training officers will be training police officers to be able to take into account. And what we found, probably to no surprise, after officers will fill out a police report, are a few things. First thing, we found that there really weren't differences among officers for explicit racism across race, gender, age, education, region, or department. We found that there really weren't differences for implicit bias either. Officers are very, very similar. There was a slight gap between whites and non-whites, but it was so marginal. It was just barely there. Another interesting pattern we found was that the relationship between implicit bias and explicit bias was weak at best, meaning the officers who exhibit implicit bias are not the same officers who exhibit explicit bias, which for me, I was like, doggone it. I at least hoped there was some synergy there to try to address it. No. And officers are just like everybody else. All of us have biases. The difference is that most of us aren't given a gun on what to do in that situation. Now, at Brookings, one of the things that we really aim to do is to come up with solutions. One of the things that we did with this study was we wanted to know, how do we address the bias? When you look at this graph, I want you to look at the two red lines on the outside. That's black men. All right, there are other groups, but black men on the far left in the red. What this graph on the y-axis, the up and down, what it's showing is the level of respect given to the person in the virtual reality that the officer interacts with. And you see that for black men in the house, a domestic scene in the house, suspicious person at the bus stop, black men are given significantly less respect, which means they're spoken to more aggressively, the officers run up on them, it seems like it's about to escalate with use of force. But in the store, we see something different. Black men are given even more respect and deference. Why is that? Well, this is why. We ask officers whether or not the person who they interacted with was a victim or a criminal. And in the store, we made it very clear that the person they were interacting with was a victim. It was a convenience store, like a 7-Eleven. They had on a uniform. When the officer walked in, they said, "Where have you been? I've been waiting on you." Instantly changes the catalyst. That's the social context. The problem, though, is that rarely do 911 calls go like that. So when it comes to the social psychology of criminalization, officers are essentially using a water bottle. And they have a certain amount of information. And then they fill up the rest of that bottle with bias and stereotypes that all of us do. But for officers, they have a very difficult job because they have to make a decision in a split second. A split second under stress, under duress, that then elicits that bias even more and sets them up oftentimes for failure. As I get ready to close, I want to talk about state-level policing. I've talked about cities. You can see where Nevada is. Nevada is kind of on the high end when it comes to across the state in terms of police killings relative to others. In Nevada, over between 2013 and 2023, 5.6 people were killed per million. That's higher than a lot of other states. A lot of that has to do with gun laws, actually. I mentioned guns earlier. What we found is that that's one of the ways that it tracks, that in places where there are more lenient gun laws, that police officers are more likely to use force because they're worried that a person might have a gun, right? And that's, on one hand, that makes a lot of sense. So we wanted to look at across these states police reform that was used to increase accountability, as well as legislation that was actually used that was pro-police. So on one hand, we have police reform for accountability. On the other hand, we have pro-police legislation that actually protected them from any sort of prosecution. Now, when you look at reforms over this 10-year period, what we can actually see with Nevada is that Nevada passed about 42% of all of the reforms that we consider to be reformatory. That's a really high percentage relative to other states. Let's go to New York, for example. So if you look at all those places on the East Coast, they're just like great. They're not doing nothing. They think they're doing a whole bunch of stuff. Like in New York, they are presenting thousands of bills. So you watch them on the news, they're doing all this yapping and all this talking, and then you actually look in the state legislature and they're not passing anything. But the public doesn't know that, right? Whereas in Nevada, what makes Nevada pretty interesting, and I'll show you all this in a second. Now, let's talk about pro-police, and then I'll make this point. When it comes to pro-policing, there were fewer pro-police policies, but across the country, states were more likely to pass those pro-police policies. Why would that be? Well, look at this. This is who controls the state legislatures. Red are Republican, blue, of course, Democrats, and then you kind of have that range there. So you can see who controls the state legislature and what's going on. In Nevada, Nevada is more likely to be controlled by a Democratic state legislature. So it makes sense why they're passing police accountability measures. But when you look at who the governors have been in the state of Nevada, it also makes sense why we've seen some pro-police protective measures, which, mind you, the way we coded them doesn't necessarily mean trying to give them immunity. That's one part, but it's also giving them resources like mental health resources, housing, ensuring that they have access to the sort of things they do, putting limits on how many hours they can work, things that I think we all want to have happen in that process. And here's one big thing about Nevada that, of course, many of you all know. Because of how Nevada is set up, the state legislature only meets once every 2 years for about a 4-month period. They're currently in session now. And the second thing is, relative to other states, they don't get paid as much. So if we look at, compared to New York, they're getting paid a whole bunch of money to do a whole bunch of stuff. Sometimes they get stuff done, sometimes they don't. But in Nevada, when they come together, they are actually getting some stuff done relative to other states. So I say that to say that the assumption is that you pay state officials a particular amount of money. Nevada and some other states suggest that there might be other ways to do it. But there are some drawbacks, because the question is, who can take this particular salary, take those number of months to go to the state legislature and do all that? It has class and education issues. Final point I want to make is about police spending. When we look across the country and we look at police spending, when it comes to Nevada, Nevada is more so on the high end. A lot of that is driven here, though, which makes sense because of the tourism that's happening here. And when you look across these states, places that get more tourism, you tend to have more spent on police, which in many regards makes sense because you have an influx of people coming in. So when you look at the amount of money spent per capita, it actually really doesn't capture all the people who are actually here all the time. It's only capturing the people who live here. And as you all know, and that I've been learning here in Las Vegas, you could be at a casino and not really be in Las Vegas. Like, you think you're in Las Vegas, but based on the actual census tract, you actually not there, right? So there are a whole bunch of things going on. There's huge variations in how much money is spent in cities on policing. And what I found that once it gets over 25, close to 30%, you get diminishing returns because police departments are getting more money to actually do a whole bunch of social services that we need other experts to be able to do. And so they're taking on too much. This was a study done by one of your colleagues here, looking at how much money is spent in cities here and then nearby cities in terms of the police budget. The big thing that I want to highlight is the far right column, is how much money is spent on policing. Look at Phoenix. That is just, y'all, every dollar that people in Phoenix pay in taxes, 49 cents is going to police. And that is one of the reasons why Arizona and Phoenix in particular are off the charts on a whole bunch of negative outcomes. Crime as well as over-policing. When you look at North Las Vegas and Las Vegas, though, much different. Part of that has to do with just the way that Vegas is set up, though, which makes it uniquely different, an interesting context by which to look at. I think what I'll do is I will essentially end. I think one point I want to make here is the amount of money spent on civilian payouts for police misconduct. From 2015 to 2019, $2 billion in taxpayer money was spent out in civilian payouts for police misconduct. So that money that I mentioned for Trayvon Martin's family was spent that way. And you have all this money going out. What's interesting about this stat, this is only for the 20 largest police departments, not the others that make up the roughly 18,000 police departments around the country. So when we talk about solutions here, one big solution that I think will address a lot of this is ensuring that police officers get certified, federally and tying that certification to insurance, like they're doing in Colorado, where police officers have to get police insurance, liability insurance. We don't want them to have to pay the whole thing. In Colorado, they're capping it at $25,000. It could be a little bit higher than that, but you link that insurance, your ability to get that, to your certification. If you can't do it, you can't be a cop. Because one pattern that we see is a lot of officers who use force have done it before, and they haven't been held accountable. But we also got to hold the police departments accountable who've trained them. But what's clear is that it shouldn't keep coming from taxpayer money when this money could be used for education, social services, and healthcare. So I look forward to any questions you all have.
Hi, I really liked your entire lecture. It was great. I was really looking forward to this. I did have a question about your thoughts on warrior versus guardian mindsets, and whether you think alternative weapons could be maybe used as a stepping stone to decrease killings, like rubber bullets and things like that.
Yeah, really good question. So warrior guardian mindset is the perspective on policing that police officers are guardians, that they're supposed to guard us. But a lot of police officers end up really embracing a warrior mindset. I saw a lot of that during the time when we were observing a recruit class during the entire time they were going through there. One quick story I'll share with you, talking about rubber bullets and stuff. They would go through the shoot, don't shoot scenario. And if the officers made a mistake and they got shot, some of the training officers would sit in the dark with a pellet gun and shoot the training officer. And they would have red dye on their shirt, and they would make them walk around for a week, letting everyone know that they had got shot and probably killed if that was real. What do you think that does to you when you go out on the street? Right? So that starts to create warriors. So as much as they talk about themselves as guardians, they're actually training as if they're warriors in battle, and that people in local communities are the enemy that they need to try to distinguish. The second part of your question, so you said warrior versus guardian, and what was the second part?
Rubber bullets.
The rubber bullets. So yeah, so I think that those de-escalation tactics are important. What's interesting about rubber bullets, the problem in the US, although I think it could work in other countries, the problem in the US that police officers will push back on, and rightfully so, is that the person who they're interacting with could have a gun with real bullets, compared to Iceland, where people can't really have guns. Now, granted, the population is very different, but there are other countries we could use. So the problem really, and this is why I was highlighting guns, is that even though there isn't a relationship between violent crime and police killings, that doesn't mean that people don't necessarily perceive it that way, and that perception becomes reality for police, that when they pull someone over, they don't know if a person could have a gun in their glove compartment. And all of the stereotypes and biases they have are fueled by that. Final thing I'll say about these de-escalation tactics, officers are trained that if they they're trained to de-escalate, some better than others. But when they're trained to de-escalate and that de-escalation doesn't work and they try twice, they actually escalate. Now, we've seen some videos where they retreat. You see these videos, they keep retreating. We can keep watching those videos. That is not how it happens often. Instead, what happens is they get more aggressive. And it could be argued that that's what they should do, right? The problem is that who they choose to escalate with and who they don't. And that's where we get into some of the racial disparities. Who do they give the benefit of the doubt to? In the virtual reality, one thing I didn't mention, the characters, when an officer would say something or get more aggressive, the character gets more aggressive, and the character would cuss at the cops, right? And what was interesting is when the white characters, particularly the white woman, would get upset and start cussing, the officers actually de-escalated. When the black characters got amped up, the officers got more aggressive. And I think that really speaks to that gap that we speak to, is that, the rubber bullet sounds great, but if they're still gonna pop somebody with 20 rubber bullets and then that person gets a $250,000 civil settlement, that's still coming out your pocket, and it hasn't changed the use of force catalyst. It's simply changed the mechanism and the weapon they use to enact that force.
Thank you. Awesome talk.
Thank you.
Considering how and why the police was created in the first place,
Yeah.
was to police Black and brown bodies. Did you look at any of that in your research being connected to what we're seeing now? And the second part of that is, do you ever think that there will be a way to deal without police?
To do without police? Yeah, great question. So yes, in fact, I'm working on a book, and one of the ways that I think about these origins is that, like, for example, when George Floyd was killed, people were calling the officer who killed him a bad apple. And one of the things that I wrote, I said, those bad apples come from somewhere. Those bad apples have been growing from rotten trees. And the rotten tree is the legacy of enslavement, the legacy of slave patrols in the United States. We cannot get away from that. And that completely maps on and tracks to what's going on now. If we look at the civil rights movement, the same cops that were preventing little black kids from going to school, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, or after Brown v. Board was passed, those were the same cops still standing there. They didn't change. The law changed, but they didn't change. And because of segregation, there were a lot of things, even including on the west side of Vegas, like I got to see yesterday, where you had over-policing happening in ways that went unknown and went unseen. I think, is there a way where we could see living without police? I don't think in this current society, I don't think so. I think that in the US, with people's access to guns and the way people interpret the Second Amendment, that it's hard to imagine that. I would tend to think that we would need a complete revitalization of society, which means a revolution of some sort to get to that. I think it would be hard to see that now.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a quick question. Okay, so in your data, did you find any differences in metrics and stats with departments headed by elected sheriffs versus appointed police chiefs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, congrats on your internship, even though, of course, you can't go. You got an internship in DC, so that's exciting. You're gonna still be able to put it on your resume, like you gotta talk about that. So I'll tell you, police departments being ran by active sheriffs. Yes, so what's interesting about most places, and I get Vegas is different, and I get the track from being a police chief and then ending up being a governor. It's like a thing here, right? Like it's a whole, like, when something happens once, I'm kind of like, that's kind of anecdotal. It happens again, I'm like, it's a pattern here, right? In most places, though, what happens is that the sheriff is elected and the police chief is appointed by the elected person, the mayor, the county executive. That's really important, as well as a third person who we have to bring in, and that is the president of the Fraternal Order of Police, which of the three, outside of probably Vegas and a few other places, the president of the Fraternal Order of Police is the most important and the most powerful. Why do I say that? Because the FOP president is elected by other cops. You look at Chicago, you look at the person who's at the top of the use of force list, is the FOP president. This dude is a bad dude, like in every way, and they keep electing him back there because they know he's gonna protect them because he has to protect himself. A lot of sheriffs, when they are elected, one of the big things the sheriff's departments deal with are house calls, domestic violence incidents, and that's very important work. I've worked with police departments and sheriff's departments to bring one big gap, and this is something you could do if you want to start working with police in any way on the side where there might be some synergy, is they deal with domestic violence incidents so much that now, they go and they got to arrest somebody, and there are kids there. Those kids have to be removed. They found that giving the kids teddy bears, when an officer comes up with a teddy bear, that helps create a bond. And it's so bad that they run out of stuffed animals, right? Just to tell you how bad this is. So sheriff's department does a lot of that. They serve a lot of warrants. If you want to start looking at, and I don't think Vegas has this problem because I looked into it, but in LA, they had this problem where LAPD and the sheriff's department were serving warrants. So in LA, you probably saw a few years ago, they were like, oh, we defunded the police. Well, yes, but what they did actually was they stopped the cross-fertilization of those departments. And they said the sheriff's department is going to do A and LAPD is going to do B, which was smart because you had all this overlapping interest that was wasting money. Same thing happened in Baltimore. So I think that oftentimes they do different things. Vegas is different in what's going on. And I oftentimes view different places as exceptions and outliers, but oftentimes teach us a lot about what's going on. And I think there is something about, particularly the way the current governor and even the former one used the trends that I showed you all, the decrease in crime, as a way to talk about, look how good we're doing on crime. Yes, like relative speaking to the amount of people that come here that they deal with on a regular basis, especially people coming to do who knows what on the Strip, not people who from Vegas, but y'all know what I'm saying, is that they actually engage in policing that people think oftentimes can be appropriate. And accordingly, they can use those trends to their advantage, because if you get Vegas and Nevada, I mean, you got the whole state. And so there are different things that the sheriff's department and police actually do. We out of time?
We probably have time for just one more question. I want to turn our attention back to where we are on the final slide here. Of the policy steps that you've recommended here, are there some that you feel are lower hanging fruit for a place like Las Vegas to implement? And what would it look like, and how would it change community policing?
Yeah, great question. So when I was talking to Bill yesterday, we were talking about, and actually you and Dave too, like the last two in particular, I think are low-hanging fruit. I tend to think that really what's low-hanging fruit are policies that give police officers more resources. Now, I know I just sat up here and talked about how their spending in some places is through the roof, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the spending shouldn't happen. There's a difference between reallocating, which is defund, compared to shifting police, right? And then also abolish the police. You got all these different terms. Abolish, they don't exist. Defund is reallocate from police to other things because they bloated. And then you have shifting within the police budget. When you hear police talk and they say, we don't have any money, they oftentimes don't have any money. It's kind of interesting because they've appropriated money for specific things. And the reason how their budgets get bloated is they sit in a city council meeting, county council, and someone says, oh, we need somebody to check for potholes. We need somebody to do house calls. We need somebody to do all this. And police say, we'll do it, we'll do it, we'll do it. So their budget keeps getting bigger. I think those two are low-hanging fruit. In Las Vegas, they've started the mental health counseling for police officers. That needs to be mandatory because you destigmatize mental health services. And one big thing related to police that I think is really important is that 80% of cops suffer from chronic stress. Reoccurring memories, family relationship problems, all that kind of stuff. 1 out of 6 report suicidal thoughts, roughly 1 out of 6 substance abuse. 90% never seek help. Easy solution. You normalize it. You can't stigmatize it because they're worried that when they try to work on specialty units, narcotics, or investigative units, homicide or whatever, that they're going to be stigmatized if they go to mental health. But when you normalize it like they're doing here in Vegas, like they've done in Raleigh, you get some really good outcomes. Second thing I would say is when it comes to mental health co-responder programs. In Vegas, there is a homeless population. There is a population that experiences mental health problems. Police are not necessarily always the best people to respond to that. And we know there are gaps in mental health counselors, but that is something that could be driven. That's something UNLV could really address in terms of, I did the analysis for the state of New Jersey, looking at their new program called Arrive Together, co-responder program between police and mental health experts. They show up first, police back them up. You can see the stat. There were very few arrests, very few times where use of force was used, and it really, really works. Now, what you're gonna hear in the future in New Jersey is they've allowed for every jurisdiction to decide how they wanna roll this out. I get that autonomy, but the research is showing a particular thing works, right? Now you're gonna do a whole bunch of pilot studies and they're not gonna work, and then they're gonna be looking at the data and you're gonna have some use of force incidents and people gonna be mad. Yeah, because you went and did your own thing and you didn't follow what the research said, right? So I think that's a big one. The final one I'll say is housing for cops. Cops need to live where they police. The problem is they don't know the communities, but the issue is they can't oftentimes afford to live in metro areas. Give them a housing subsidy, $25,000, $50,000, that's contingent they stay there. And if they don't stay there for 10 years, then they gotta pay that back, meaning when they sell their home, say they only live there 5 years, and they gotta pay back half of the loan that they got in the equity that they made in their house. So I think those are the low-hanging fruit that are the best things. The biggest impact is really the insurance and a couple other things.
You'll join me in thanking Rashawn Ray for his lecture
Thank you all.
tonight.
Thanks.
If you have any lingering questions, Rashawn will be here for a couple additional minutes. I know we ran short on everyone's questions, but thank you for the thought-provoking talk. Before we conclude, I also want to remind you our next talk in the Spring 2025 Brookings Scholar Lecture Series will actually be on Wednesday, April 2nd, so about a month from now, here in Greenspun Auditorium again at 6 p.m. We're going to be joined by our Brookings Metro colleague, Rob Maxim, for his first visit to Brookings Mountain West. He'll be presenting a lecture titled Investing in Left Behind Places, Learning from Our Native American Tribal Communities, which will be an interesting talk. We hope to see you on April 2nd. Thank you again, and have a great night, everyone.